We've been working through a sermon series on the book of Lamentations, and it's really been about grief and loss, and we've been using Lamentations as kind of our textbook. And I've joked throughout that, what a way to begin the new year. Start off with grief and loss. But, I think it fits in some ways. Because we got to work through stuff that's going on in our life to see and embrace what's next. And in gut-wrenching fashion, we just heard from Lamentations chapter 4, in gut-wrenching fashion, the author explores the pain of loss. Right? And in this passage we just read, there are really tangible objects that kind of raise to the surface that the author draws our attention to. And of course, the people of Israel, just to kind of recap a little bit with you, people of Israel had been overtaken by the nation Babylon. Their city had been overrun. Many of the people who lived in that place had been taken away. We call them exiles. They had been taken away all over the place. Their temple had been ransacked. Things were not looking good. And real people were suffering. People had died. People were starving. Just really difficult situation. And of course, in this situation, as the author is naming these tangible things, names the gold, right? The gold has lost its luster. Jewelry may have been stolen or scattered about, but it lands on children, right? Our children, people who are invaluable. And as we read this description, we hear the author writing about children who are begging, hungry, destitute. He goes on and later in the chapter, and because this is a family show, we're not going to read that section, but it goes on in graphic detail. For those of you who are adults, can read a little bit later in this very chapter. It goes on in graphic detail to describe the lengths at which parents are forced to go sometimes. It is an untenable situation. So these vivid descriptions, I think, in chapter 4 beg the question, how will we help these vulnerable people? The text sort of personifies the gems scattered in the streets like children that have been scattered about, and it sort of comes to this driving conclusion. What can we do to help these people? What will we do? How will we help these people who are vulnerable and lost and in suffering and broken and starving? What will we do to help them? And the meek and terrifying and gut-wrenching response that we get from the book of Lamentations is that we can't. It's stark. How can we help them? There is nothing we can do. That's the driving point, really, of a lot of Lamentations, but particularly of this chapter. The driving emotion is one of powerlessness. There is nothing we can do to help these people who are suffering. We want more than anything to look after these vulnerable ones who are scattered like gold on the streets, and we can't do anything. I mean, can you imagine what that may feel like? Watching your kids suffer, and you would do absolutely anything to stop it, but you're utterly powerless to stop it. And there's some of us in this room that can imagine. Some of us in this room, we know what that feels like because it's happened to us. We've been in that place. We very much can relate to the cries of Lamentations. And if some of us here in this room, if we haven't been through that kind of powerlessness, if we haven't been through that kind of horror, the vast majority of us can sympathize with what that might feel like and maybe even empathize. We know that no matter how big or how small, every one of us has been through the powerlessness of loss. Every one of us has suffered through death, through disappointment or career changes or health crises or moves or breakups or failures or mistakes. And so even if in a small way, we know, we have experience to imagine what it may have been like for those people in Lamentations, this suffering, hopelessness and powerlessness and Lamentations. And when our friends and our family and our neighbors and the people we're sitting next to in the pews here in this church and the people that we love and care about who are not here this morning, when the people in our lives go through these sorts of things, when they find themselves with new or different employment, or they say farewell to beloved teachers or pastors or mentors, and when they go through drug and alcohol treatment, or they go through breakups or have bad grades, or go through death and disease, when the people in our lives we love go through these things, we do what people do. We do what God designed us to do, and that's that we empathize. Our hearts go out. That's really what empathy means. Our heart goes out. We put ourselves in someone else's shoes. We imagine what it might feel like to be them. Our hearts go out. They are gems. They are gold. They are valuable. We love them immensely. And it's in that moment where we feel that empathy, where our hearts go out to them, when we're reminded that, not unlike the author in Lamentations, even though we wish to do something, our path is blocked. We can't make it right. It may be that we're not miracle workers. None of us here are Jesus in flesh and blood. We can't bring the dead back to light. It may just be an obvious thing. There's no quick fix. Someone might be going through suffering that we can do nothing about. We're powerless to help. It may be we may feel powerless because we don't really know. It may be a matter of self-confidence. Right? What am I going to do to help? We may kind of stand like Moses in Exodus, who says, who am I to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? We may kind of question our own ability to engage. We may point to our lack of education. I'm not a therapist, so what am I supposed to do to help this person? Or we may know too much. This is kind of my go-to one. We may know what it feels like to be in loss and to feel and to have our loss compounded by hurtful things, by do-gooders that aren't doing very much good. We don't want to be the idiots that are like Job's friends who come in to help and tell Job that it's all your fault that you're going through this, right? We don't want to do that. And so often I think we feel powerlessness. And so the question that I want to ask on all of our behalves this morning is, when we go through suffering, when we see people around us that we love go through suffering, when we see people in our lives, and when our friends and when our family go through loss and pain, when we feel powerless to help, what can we do? Is there anything we can do at all? Last week we looked at sort of like what does it look like to go through grief well? And I made the argument that one absolutely essential thing is to go through grief in community, to not go through it in isolation, to go through grief in process with other people. And this week we're kind of looking at the other end. Okay, well, let's say we are the community. How do we help the person we love who's going through grief? What can we do? So I have a short video that kind of illustrates a little bit of this, and I don't know if hopefully we have audio. I'm going to run it a couple of times because it's very short, but here you go. A lady, she got in an accident.
You're in the bike lane.
You see it one more time.
You're in the bike lane.
I really love this. Do you guys catch this? You guys need to see it one more time. The lady got in a car accident. She's sitting there on the curb crying, and this helpful guy comes around to help her with her loss. All right, here we go. One more time. One more time.
You're in the bike lane.
I really love that. You're in the bike lane. That's what he says. You're in the bike lane. Helpful. Thank you very much. So of course, none of us want to be like that kind of helper, right? None of us want to be that kind of helper. And so my hope is that we can kind of look at some strategies for how to be a helpful helper that doesn't compound the losses and make things worse. We don't want to be you're in the bike lane kind of helpers. So I have 3 suggestions for our sermon this morning, or for what remains of the sermon. And each of these are, kind of, I think they touch on some of the themes that we've looked at in the book of Lamentations so far. So the first suggestion And it has to do with this. Today, in the Adventist tradition, we have this tradition of religious liberty Sabbaths. Anybody ever heard of religious liberty Sabbath? So in the Adventist tradition, religious liberty is kind of a big deal for a lot of people. And the idea is that in Adventist theology, we think that people having freedom of conscience to choose to believe and to choose to worship how they wish is really important. And that's even if someone chooses to not, and I think especially if someone chooses to not be a part of the Adventist church or to be a Christian or to worship however, that we think that should be protected for all people. And now, some of you who kind of know the history, you may say, well, it's sort of self-serving, and maybe that's true, because we Adventists, we kind of, we're here on a Saturday instead of on a Sunday, and so we're kind of weird compared to other Christians. But I value and affirm that principle. I think all people ought to have not to be compelled by anyone, whether it's a government or some group or even religious people themselves. I think we all ought to have complete freedom of conscience to choose how we worship and to whom we worship. And so today, Religious Liberty Sabbath, it's this once-a-year thing where we kind of remind ourselves of how important it is to push for that and to fight for that for other people and to be grateful for that ourselves. And so the denomination, they put out this magazine, Liberty Magazine. You can learn all about this thing. There's a whole stack of these brochures in the lobby. I know, I think the denomination sends, one of these magazines to every single senator and representative and the American government, and maybe they send it elsewhere, kind of reminding them. But so me sort of bringing this up or reminding you or telling you that it's Religious Liberty Sabbath is kind of my way of saying that I think that one of the things that we learn in the book of Lamentations is that Lamentations gives us freedom to grieve how we need to grieve how we wish to. One of the things we talked about in the very first week was that, that there are models. We'll see if we can get this. There we go. Freedom. There it is. There's your icon. But one of the things we talked about, on the first week of this sermon series, we talked about there's all sorts of different models for what we might expect when we go through grief and loss. And we talked about how they can be useful, but it's not like one of them is true, right one. No, we talked about how everyone is unique in their process. Some of these models might be helpful at one time or another. We all go through different stuff and different feelings and different emotions. Talked about how, Lamentations, for example, gives us permission to even be angry at God, right? There's great freedom that is granted in how we process grief and loss. One thing that we've seen throughout this book is that God grants us freedom to grieve how we need to process how we need to, even if that includes being frustrated with Him. And I think that there is something that we, as people who support people around us, I think there's something that we can learn for how we might relate with those people that we love. And so this is the first tip. I think that we can help people who are in grief and loss by giving them the freedom to do what they need to do. I think those of us, we can empathize in this room. We can empathize. We can give the benefit of the doubt. We can give grace. We don't need to understand why someone is doing what they're doing when they're going through grief in order to love them and to be kind. I don't need to understand it in order for it to be okay. We don't need to. I think that it's possible to blindly give generosity to people who are in suffering. I think it's possible to give unconditional love to people around us. Paige the other day, over the summer, she got a flat tire when she was on the 210. How's that sound? Do I sound like a Californian? The 210. I didn't even say highway. I said the 210. Yeah, she was on the 210, and she was getting on the 34 and the 48, and then went over to the. Anyway, she got a flat tire, and she was on the 210, and she was stopped, and she called me, and I was actually in a meeting, and I had to race out of this meeting to go and try to find her on the freeway and help. But before I got there was this, San Bernardino County has these rescue dudes that are drive around, and maybe girls, I don't know, but these rescue trucks that drive around, and they just look for people to help on the freeways. And so this guy, this San Bernardino County guy in his truck, he came and he he stopped behind so the cars, because it was on this really narrow place where there wasn't much of a shoulder, and she was up against a wall, and so I was like telling her to not get out of the car and to keep her seatbelt on and all this stuff, and so this guy came and he parked his truck and sort of blocked it in, and he took care of it. He had a pump in his truck, and he pumped it up, and then he followed her the couple of miles to the tire place. It was really great. He was awesome. But I want you to imagine for a moment that Paige has this flat tire on the side of the road, and this guy comes, right? The San Bernardino guy. This didn't happen. Just you're imagining with me, right? He did all of the right stuff. He was perfect. But we're imagining a different parallel scenario where he pulls up, and then he kind of comes up to the window and says, "Well, you're doing it all wrong, woman. What's wrong with you? Why are you going to flat tire?" "Well, it's because you're dumb and you didn't do this and that and the other thing. And what you need to do is get your thing here and do that with the other thing and get this wrench thingamajig and do that. But no, you're not doing that, right?" Like what, I mean, no, right? It would be absolutely insane. There's a time, he might be right, but there's a time to explain what and how people should do different things different ways. But that time is not when someone is in crisis, right? The time for explaining and correcting and giving advice and telling people why what they're doing is wrong and it's not the right, the time for that, like there is a time for that. But it's not when someone is in trauma and crisis. It's not when they're going through grief and loss. And I think that it's possible for us to blindly support, to give blind grace and freedom and kindness for people to do what they need to do in order to make it through that season. So that's the first one. Give people the kind of freedom. Oh, we made it out. We're on something else. We're on call to prayer. We need help. Well, we'll get to it. We'll get back to the right presentation. So, there we are. Well, we're in the right presentation now. So we'll plow forward. Oh no, go back. Back one. Yes, I don't. Well, I'll just tell you what should be up there. You can put it on there. So, are you with me? That's the first protection. That's the bird, all right? The freedom, the dove. The dove we're letting free. Give people freedom to grieve how they need to. That's number one. Number two, if you were, the map thing was the right one. Look at that. So, if you were to ask me what career I would love to have, like in heaven, I was talking to my brother-in-law the other day, and we were talking about calling and career, and one of the things that they said a lot when I was in seminary and in theology was that if you could have a clean conscience doing anything else, then do that, because you shouldn't be, like, if you want to be a pastor, do that if you couldn't do anything else with a clean conscience. And a lot of my classmates and I identify with that sort of feeling, that it just feels like the thing that we need to do. So I won't say, like, if I had to choose it all over again, because if I could choose it all over, I would do the same thing. But if I had some kind of if we were in a parallel universe, or we in heaven, the career that I would choose for myself would be to be a tour guide. I would be a tour guide. I love to travel. I love to explore and to learn all sorts of new stuff. And what I really love is I love to I love to explain things to people. I love to see people's eyes brighten up. I love to see the joy of discovery in people. I love to take people's hand and walk alongside them and kind of show them new things and interesting things and tell them all sorts of stuff that they never knew they wanted to hear about. If I could, if I had like a parallel universe or whatever, and I want to be a tour guide. I love being a tour guide. And so here's the thing. Here's the thing about tour guides. We all are tour guides in our own ways. We're all mentors. Those of us who are parents, we are tour guides for our kids. Many of us are teachers and educators and social workers and therapists. We all are tour guides. And you know what's worse than having no tour guide at all? It's having a tour guide who doesn't know their way around. That's where, like, it'd be better to have no tour guide at all than have to, I've visited a number of different countries, sometimes with tour guides. My first trip to Europe was when I was a junior. We had a great tour guide, but what's worse than having no tour guide would be to have one that's never been to the place before, and they're just kind of, discovering it with you, right? It's the worst possible thing. And one of the most painful things for me in my processes of going through grief and loss has been an implicit or explicit pressure to move on or to get over it. To kind of have that word. It's sort of like, empathy as our heart goes out. The impulse of moving on is that, my heart stays here. And I think a lot of times, for those of us who have been through grief and loss, we maybe identify with what it feels like to feel pressure to get over it, or to move on, or to be normal, or to not have that loss going on in us anymore. And I think that a lot of times this impulse, this pressure that people can put off, or that we can put off, it has far more to do with us and our own stuff than it has to do with anyone else. Sort of the opposite of our heart goes out. And I think often this happens if you interact with someone who pressures you to move on. I think often it has to do with projection. It's my own personal discomfort with this person who's with me, who's going through loss. And so I pressure them to get over the loss because I'm not really comfortable with them being in loss. If you think about Jesus, at least in what I've read from Jesus, I don't see Jesus minimizing or pressuring people to move on. And I think we could argue that he went through among the most pain anyone would or could go through. I don't think that we can be a helpful tour guide for people that we love who are going through grief if we haven't worked on our own stuff a little bit. We can't be a helpful tour guide if we haven't been there even just a little bit. And if we haven't done some of the work, the temptation will be really strong to pressure them to move on, to disengage, to not go along with them. So the second item for us today, the second strategy, is to do the work. Sit through this sermon series on the book of Lamentations. Yay, you. Congrats. You're doing the work, right? We think about, what did we do on the first time? We talked about the importance of naming it. That's work when it comes to grief and loss. Some of us have went through something 20 years ago with that person in that room, right? So we haven't yet come to the place where we could even name that was a loss. Right? So this is a big deal. It's not just an easy thing, but that's the first step. And then we talked about how important it is to allow ourselves to feel what we feel. And if it's anger, and if we're enraged at God, or if we're embarrassed, or we're guilty, we got to feel what we feel. And that can be really hard work. And then last week we talked about how it's really important to not be isolated. We need to connect with other people. And that's hard work. It's hard work to go through this stuff. But look at you guys. You are doing it. We work through this stuff. We educate ourselves. And as we educate ourselves and as we do our own work, we empower ourselves to be useful to people around us. And we know not to do silly things like pressure people to move on or ask why they're not over it yet, because we know the roadmap. We're a good tour guide. We've been there, or we've been to a place that's sort of like it, and so we kind of have an idea, right? It's hard. It's hard to do it this way. It's hard to go through this work. It's easy to give amazing facts and give explanations and give tips and tricks and advice. It's difficult to go through it ourselves. But that is the second suggestion for this morning. Do the work. Give people freedom and do the work ourselves. Finally, a third suggestion. And for this, we're going to glance back at Lamentations, but we're going to move forward from our scripture. As our scripture was the very beginning of Lamentations chapter 4, but I want you to read with me verse 17 of Lamentations. And this is our third suggestion this morning. We watched and we watched. This is from the Message paraphrase. We watched and we watched, and we wore our eyes out looking for help, and nothing. It's a gut-wrenching book. We watched and watched. We wore our eyes out looking for help, and nothing. We mounted our lookouts and looked for the help that never showed up. It didn't ever come. Being in loss can feel sometimes like no one is coming to save you. That's what it can feel like sometimes. No one is coming. And honestly, there's some truth to that. That's how we get into loss, because no one came. We didn't get saved. And that's why we're there. And at the same time, well, we can't come and save the person that we love from the loss that we're going through. We can't fix it. We can't make it go away. Even though we can still show up. We don't have to know the right words to say. There are no words that can make it better. We don't have to know how to pray. We don't have to know the right theology. We don't have to have a degree. We don't have to be a social worker or a therapist. All we need to do is to be warm, to be alive, to walk through the door, to show up in the room. We can be the warm arms that wrap around someone. And that's the third suggestion for us today. Just be present. Be there. Be in the discomfort. Be in the pain. Be present. There's this old Jewish tradition, many of us are aware of it. It's called Shiva. And it's part of the 7-day mourning period for kind of traditional Jewish people, and it's considered the third of 5 stages of mourning. And Shiva is this time where relatives and friends come and they spend time, and it's a time of talking about and discussing the loss, and it's a time where mourners spend time and they visit and bring condolences and comfort. It's a time of reflection and prayer, and it's a time where it allows, like we said, the freedom for people to express their loss and sorrow before slowly re-entering society. And you kind of have hints and tinges of this idea of Shiva, sitting Shiva throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. Joseph in Genesis chapter 50, as he grieves his father, it describes him going through this 7-day period of mourning. And then Job, same thing, a 7-day period of mourning. It says he sat on the ground for 7 days. And then in Leviticus chapter 10, Aaron goes through a very similar process as him. And in fact, if you believe it or not, Leviticus, when it's read aloud, or not Leviticus, Lamentations, when it's read aloud, we talked about in the very first week that every year on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, this Jewish festival remembering the destruction of the temple, the book of Lamentations is read aloud. And that tradition itself is an embodiment of Shiva. It's an embodiment of this ritual, this process of being present. And I'm not saying that we all should, we need to, bring back this thing in Adventism or in Christianity. I'm not making that argument at all. But I think that we can embody the spirit of it. I think we can embrace the idea of sitting Shiva, of being present as kind of a guiding metaphor. We can be Jesus' hands and feet in the lives of the people that we love, the people that are around us. We can be the answer to the prayers that people in our lives are praying. We can incarnate. Jesus was God and became human. He entered into our world. We can enter into the world of the people around us in love. We don't have to say anything. We don't have to do anything. We can't fix it, but we can show up. We can make the phone call. We can send the text message. We can send flowers. We can send a card in the mail. We can call them up and ask them if they want to go to lunch or if they want to go to coffee. We can show up with a random meal at their doorstep without announcement. We can do all sorts of things. We can mow their lawn and we can do their laundry. We can show up and we can be Jesus. So that's the third. That's the third suggestion. We've come now to the end. We can give people freedom. We can do our own work. Congrats, you're doing it now. And we can show up. We can be present. These are things that we can do even when we feel powerless in grief and loss. There are still things that we can do. And as we close the service, I want you to think about the person Maybe for some of you, as we kind of introduce this, as we talked about, this service is about thinking about the people we love and know who are going through suffering. I want you to think about the person. Maybe someone came to your mind, someone you know who's recently gone through loss. Maybe they're going through some treatment for a disease has a challenging diagnosis, or maybe someone you know who's lost someone that they loved to death, or maybe someone who's going through difficulty in their business, or maybe maybe there's someone who's gotten a new job, maybe not by their first choice. You know what I'm saying? Or maybe maybe you know a teenager who's gone through a breakup that's been really painful. I don't know. We've all sorts of thoughts. But who is the person that you've been avoiding because of their pain? Who's the person that you can't get out of your mind? Who do you need to show up for today? In just a second, the band is going to come back up, and maybe that's right now. You guys got to make your way up. We're going to sing a song. We're going to sing an old hymn, "In the Garden." And I want to invite you to sing it with a little bit of a different spirit today. This is a song, "In the Garden." We walk in the garden alone. It's this kind of conjures up this idea of how we walk with God, how we have this connection and relationship with God. And that's a beautiful and true thing. I want you to think about singing it with a little bit of a different spirit this morning. I want you to sort of imagine, what might it be like? What if I'm Jesus' hands and feet? If I'm Jesus' hands and feet, how can I be the one who walks with my friend through grief? I want you to kind of imagine and maybe allow God to speak to you. How can I show up for the person in my life? How can I be the one who walks and supports and loves and blesses? Not trying to futilely take the pain away, not trying to solve the problem, not abandoning them, but being present. So let's sing this song maybe in a little bit of a different way, and it'll be familiar for some of us. It's